There are certain objects a person keeps not because they are valuable in any way a stranger would understand, but because they are load-bearing in some private architecture of memory that only makes sense from the inside. For me, that object was a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro, dark green, the paint gone slightly matte with age in a way I'd always found more honest than a fresh coat would have been. And I want to tell you about that car before I tell you about my daughter, because I don't think the second part of this story means anything without the first. My name is Daniel Whitcomb. I'm 58 years old. I run a small commercial insurance agency in Knoxville, Tennessee, that I built up over 3 decades from a single desk in a shared office space. And the Camaro sitting in my garage for the better part of 40 years was the first car I ever owned. Bought at 17 with money I'd saved from 2 summers of mowing lawns, and a loan from my father that I paid back in full. With the specific stubborn pride of a teenager, determined to prove he didn't need to be given anything. My father, Walter Whitcomb, had been a machinist his whole working life, and the two of us spent the better part of a year, evenings and weekends, rebuilding that Camaro's engine in our garage on Sutherland Avenue, him teaching me the specific patience mechanical work requires, me absorbing considerably more about him. His humor, his exacting standards, the particular quiet satisfaction he took in doing something difficult correctly, than I absorbed about carburetors. Though I absorbed plenty of that too. I remember specific evenings from that year with a clarity I don't have for most of my adolescence. My father's hands, permanently stained at the knuckles with decades of machine oil that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed, guiding my own clumsier hands toward the correct torque on a bolt, correcting me without ever once making the correction feel like criticism. He wasn't a man who said, "I love you" often or easily, but he said it constantly in that garage, in the specific patience of explaining something a second time without frustration, in the 6-packs of cream soda he kept in a cooler for the two of us on hot Saturday afternoons, in the way he'd step back after we finally got that engine turning over for the first time and simply put his hand on my shoulder, saying nothing at all, letting the moment speak for itself. My father died 11 years ago, and the Camaro became, in the years since, something closer to a shrine than a vehicle, driven maybe twice a year, kept under a fitted cover in my garage the rest of the time. A physical artifact of the single closest stretch of time I ever spent with a man who wasn't, by nature, an easy person to get emotionally close to. My daughter Emma grew up around that car her entire childhood, knew its history the way she knew any other piece of family lore, used to sit in the driver's seat as a little girl pretending to steer while I worked underneath it on some minor maintenance task. And I want you to hold that image, because it matters for understanding exactly what it did to me, at 58 years old, to discover, on a Tuesday morning in September, that the garage was empty. Asterisk, if you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Now let's get back to it. Asterisk, I need to back up, though, because the empty garage wasn't really the beginning of this story, only the moment I could no longer avoid understanding how much of the story I'd already missed. Emma is 24 years old, our only child, and for the first 21 years of her life, she was, by any measure a parent could reasonably ask for, a genuinely easy kid to raise, good grades without needing to be pushed, a wide circle of friends, a specific, stubborn kindness that had her organizing food drives at her high school and volunteering at an animal shelter every weekend of her junior year without either Carol or me ever having to suggest it. She went to the University of Tennessee, majored in early childhood education, and seemed, right up until the spring of her senior year, to be building exactly the kind of steady, purposeful life Carol and I had always hoped for both our daughter and, honestly, ourselves. Carol, my wife, taught middle school science for over 2 decades before retiring 3 years ago, and between the two of us, we'd always considered ourselves fairly attentive parents, the kind who showed up to every school event, who knew Emma's friends by name, who talked with her regularly about the ordinary difficulties of growing up without, we believed, ever being intrusive about it. I mention this not to defend ourselves in advance, but because I think it matters for understanding how genuinely blindsided we both were by what happened, how little either of us had any framework, going in, for recognizing the specific, quiet mechanics of addiction taking hold of someone we thought we knew as well as any parent can know a child. The injury that changed everything happened in March of her senior year. A bad fall during an intramural soccer game that fractured her ankle in 3 places, requiring surgery and a recovery that turned out to be considerably more prolonged and painful than any of us, including her doctors, initially expected. She was prescribed a fairly standard course of opioid pain medication following the surgery, a medication regimen her orthopedic surgeon monitored carefully, tapering the dosage on a schedule that seemed, at the time, entirely appropriate and unremarkable. I want to be honest that neither Carol nor I thought much about that prescription at the time beyond ordinary parental concern for her physical recovery, because we had no particular reason in the spring of that year to think of it as anything other than a normal part of healing from a serious injury. Asterisk if you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think, and we're nowhere near the end of this one. Asterisk. I understand now, with the specific, painful clarity that only comes from looking backward, that the months following her surgery were when the actual trouble began, though it would be well over a year before Carol or I understood what we were actually looking at. Emma graduated on schedule that May, walked across the stage with the rest of her class, and moved into her first apartment near the elementary school where she'd landed a teaching position. And if her energy seemed a little different that summer, a little more unpredictable than the daughter we'd known, we attributed it, the way parents often do, to the ordinary stress of a major life transition. A first real job, a first apartment. The specific overwhelm of adult responsibility landing all at once after 4 relatively structured years of college. The signs, looking back, were there considerably earlier than either of us wanted to admit once we finally understood what we were seeing. Emma stopped coming to Sunday dinners as regularly as she once had, always with an explanation that seemed reasonable in isolation. A lesson plan she was behind on, a headache, a friend's birthday she'd forgotten about until the last. She borrowed money from us twice that first year out of college, small amounts, a few $100s each time, explanations that made sense on their own, a car repair, a security deposit shortfall, but that, strung together in a pattern neither Carol nor I noticed until much later, should have told us something we weren't yet prepared to see. I remember a specific Thanksgiving that first year after graduation when Emma arrived nearly 2 hours late, offering a vague explanation about traffic that didn't quite match the empty roads either Carol or I had driven that same morning. And I remember choosing, in that moment, to let it go rather than press her on it, telling myself I didn't want to start a holiday with an argument over something so minor. I think about that decision often now, one of dozens of small moments across that first year where a different kind of attention, or a different kind of courage to actually ask the harder question, might have moved our understanding of what was happening considerably earlier than it eventually arrived. Asterisk if this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. Asterisk. The confrontation that finally forced the issue into the open happened almost 2 years after her surgery, in the spring, when Emma's school principal called Carol directly, having exhausted her attempts to reach Emma herself, to report that Emma had missed 9 days of work in the preceding 6 weeks, several without any advance notice at all, a pattern that had triggered a formal review of her employment. Carol drove to Emma's apartment that same afternoon and found our daughter in a state that neither of us had any framework for processing. Thin, in a way that frightened Carol immediately. The apartment itself in a specific disarray that bore no resemblance to the careful, organized young woman we'd raised, and Emma herself defensive and evasive in a way that felt, Carol told me afterward, like talking to someone wearing our daughter's face without quite being her anymore. Carol called me from Emma's apartment parking lot that evening, and I remember driving there myself within the hour, the specific dread of that drive, not yet knowing the full shape of what we were dealing with but understanding, from the strain in Carol's voice, that whatever it was had moved well beyond the ordinary explanations we'd been accepting for the better part of a year. It took another 8 months, following that initial confrontation, of increasingly difficult conversations, 2 unsuccessful attempts at outpatient counseling that Emma abandoned within weeks each time, and a slow, agonizing unraveling of the daughter we thought we knew, before Carol and I finally had the full picture, that the opioid prescription following her surgery had, over roughly 18 months, evolved into a dependency that outlasted her legitimate medical need for the medication by a considerable margin, and that when her doctor eventually stopped renewing the prescription, recognizing signs of dependency himself, Emma had transitioned, in the specific way addiction specialists later explained to us is tragically common, to obtaining opioids through other means entirely, a transition that had, by the time we finally understood its full scope, been underway for the better part of a year. Asterisk, if you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Asterisk, I want to describe, as honestly as I can, what those months of slow discovery did to Carol and me as parents, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after, including the morning I found the garage empty. We tried, in the specific, well-intentioned but often poorly informed way many parents try, to manage the crisis ourselves at first, direct conversations, ultimatums, a family meeting where we laid out clear expectations and consequences that Emma agreed to in the moment and was unable, we came to understand, to actually sustain, not from any lack of love for us or desire to get better, but because the specific mechanics of opioid dependency, as we eventually learned from professionals who understood it far better than we initially did, are not something willpower alone can overcome, however genuine the willpower. We lost, over the following year, a version of our daughter that I don't think either Carol or I ever fully stopped grieving even after Emma eventually found her way to recovery, because grief, we learned, doesn't require a death to be genuine, only the loss of a person you loved existing in the form you knew. Emma lied to us, repeatedly in ways that were, we came to understand, symptoms of the disease itself rather than a fundamental betrayal of character, though understanding that intellectually did very little in the moment to soften how much each individual lie hurt. She lost her teaching job that autumn, following a second, more serious attendance violation. She moved back home with us for a stretch that winter, an arrangement Carol and I hoped, with a specific, desperate optimism, might provide the stability she needed to finally get better, an arrangement that instead exposed both of us, for the first time directly, to the full daily reality of what active addiction actually looks like inside a household. I remember Carol standing in our own kitchen one night that winter, close to midnight, having just discovered that a small amount of cash she'd left in a kitchen drawer had gone missing. And I remember the specific way she looked at me, not asking a question, because we both already knew the answer, just standing there with the particular exhaustion of a parent who has run out of new ways to be surprised by the same underlying reality. We started that winter, locking our bedroom door at night, a decision that felt, at the time, like one of the strangest and most painful adaptations either of us had ever had to make inside our own home, protecting ourselves from a daughter we loved completely, in a house we'd built specifically to be a place none of us ever had to protect ourselves from each other. Asterisk, if you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you. The morning I found the garage empty was a Tuesday in September, roughly 14 months after Emma had moved back into our house, during what Carol and I had, with hindsight, come to recognize as one of the harder stretches of that entire difficult year. I had been away for 3 days on a work trip to Nashville, and I remember the specific, gut-level wrongness I felt walking into the garage that Tuesday morning before work. The empty space where the fitted cover and the Camaro beneath it had sat for the better part of a decade, replaced by nothing but the oil stain the car had left on the concrete floor over 40 years of parking in that exact spot. I called Carol first, standing in that empty garage, my voice, she told me later, sounding strange enough that she knew immediately something was seriously wrong before I'd even explained. Neither of us, in that first confused hour, considered Emma as the explanation, because neither of us, even 14 months into her active addiction, had yet let ourselves imagine she might do something specifically involving my father's car, an object we both understood, without ever having needed to say it explicitly, occupied a category entirely separate from the money and possessions that had already gone missing from our house over the preceding year. Asterisk, if you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel. Asterisk, Emma admitted it within the hour. When Carol finally reached her by phone, her voice, Carol told me afterward, carrying a specific flatness that had become disturbingly familiar over the preceding year, the particular effect of someone too deep into active addiction to fully access the weight of what they were describing. She had sold the Camaro 5 days earlier, while I was in Nashville, to a private buyer she'd found through an online classified listing, for considerably less than the car was actually worth, a fact that told me, even in the depths of my own shock and anger that morning, exactly how urgently she'd needed cash, and how little the car's actual value had factored into her decision beyond how quickly it could be converted into money. I drove home from my office that morning without fully remembering the drive afterward, the specific texture of that entire day compressed, in memory, into a handful of disconnected, overwhelming fragments. Standing in the empty garage a second time, as though looking again might somehow produce a different result, sitting across from Emma at our kitchen table that evening in a conversation that I do not think either of us, even now, fully remembers in complete detail. Both of us too raw in the moment for memory to hold onto much beyond the emotional weight of it. Asterisk, if this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. Asterisk. What Emma told us that evening, in fragments interrupted by her own tears, and my own difficulty listening without either exploding or breaking down myself, was that she needed the money for a debt to someone she was afraid of, a debt that had, over the preceding weeks, escalated to the point where she genuinely believed selling the Camaro was her only available option, a decision made, she told us, in a state of active withdrawal-driven panic that she readily acknowledged. Even in that raw moment, she would never have made with any clarity of mind available to her. I want to be honest that this explanation did very little that evening to soften the specific devastation of losing my father's car, a devastation that existed, for me, on an entirely different register than the financial loss, however significant that was too. I remember, at one point during that kitchen table conversation, asking Emma directly whether she understood what that car actually meant to me, and watching her face collapse in a way that told me, even through my own anger, that she understood completely, that some part of her had known exactly what she was destroying even in the depths of whatever desperation had driven the decision, and that the knowing hadn't been enough in that moment to stop her. I think that specific realization, that addiction could override even a clear, conscious understanding of what a choice would cost someone she loved, was the moment I finally began to understand, at some deeper level than the intellectual one, that I was dealing with something considerably larger than a series of bad decisions my daughter kept making. Carol and I did not sleep that night, sitting up together long after Emma had finally gone to bed, working through a decision that felt, at the time, like the hardest one either of us had ever had to make together as parents. We had read enough by that point about the specific ineffectiveness of enabling behavior in active addiction to understand, intellectually, that we could not simply continue absorbing consequences on Emma's behalf indefinitely, that doing so, however loving the impulse behind it, was, according to everything the addiction counselors we'd consulted had told us, more likely to prolong her addiction than resolve it. We also understood with equal clarity that we were not equipped, as two parents without any professional training, to navigate what was clearly a full-blown crisis on our own any longer. Asterisk, if you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going. Asterisk, we called an addiction interventionist the following morning, a woman named Dr. Beverly Hahn, who came recommended by Emma's original outpatient counselor as someone who specialized in exactly the kind of full family crisis intervention we needed. And Dr. Hahn met with Carol and me alone first, that same week, to help us understand what an effective intervention would actually require, cautioning us gently but firmly that the goal of the process wasn't to punish Emma for the car, however justified our anger, but to create a structured, loving pathway toward treatment that had a genuine chance of succeeding where our own well-intentioned efforts over the preceding 14 months had not. Dr. Hahn spent nearly 3 hours with us during that first consultation, walking through the specific mechanics of how a family intervention actually works, the importance of every participant speaking from a place of love rather than accusation, the necessity of having a concrete treatment option already secured before the intervention itself, so that Emma's agreement, if she gave it, could be acted on immediately rather than losing momentum to logistics. She told us something that stuck with me through everything that followed, that the car, however devastating its loss, was likely to be the single most useful piece of leverage in helping Emma finally understand the full scope of what her addiction had already cost, precisely because it represented something she herself clearly understood mattered beyond ordinary financial value. The formal intervention happened 12 days after I found the garage empty, in our living room, with Dr. Hahn guiding a conversation that included Carol, me, Emma's college roommate Jess, and Emma's aunt, my sister Diane, who Emma had always been particularly close to. I want to describe what it felt like to sit in that room, reading a carefully prepared statement Dr. Hahn had helped me write in the preceding days, describing not just the car, though the car was part of it, but the 14 months of watching my daughter disappear behind a disease none of us had known how to fight effectively, and offering her, at the end of that statement, a specific, structured path into a 60-day residential treatment program that Dr. Hahn had already secured a bed for, contingent on Emma's willingness to go that same day. Asterisk, if you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Asterisk, Emma agreed. After nearly 2 hours of difficult conversation, tears, and what Dr. Hahn later told us was one of the more genuinely willing interventions she'd guided in her considerable career, to enter the treatment program that same afternoon. I drove her there myself, 3 hours to a facility outside Asheville, North Carolina, neither of us saying very much during that drive, both of us, I think, too exhausted by the preceding 2 weeks to fill the silence with anything beyond the occasional, necessary logistics of the transition ahead of her. I remember, about an hour into that drive, Emma finally breaking the silence to ask me whether I thought I'd ever be able to forgive her for the car, and I remember telling her, honestly, that I didn't fully know yet, that I was still working through my own anger and grief about it, but that I loved her considerably more than I loved any car, however much that car had meant to me, and that my hope for her recovery was never contingent on that particular forgiveness arriving on any specific schedule. She cried for most of the rest of the drive after that, and I let her, understanding that some tears needed room to simply exist without either of us trying to manage them into something smaller. The 60 days that followed were, for Carol and me, their own specific kind of difficult, a stretch of enforced separation from our daughter during which we attended weekly family counseling sessions via video call with Dr. Hahn's team, slowly beginning to understand, with professional guidance, exactly how much of the preceding 2 years we had misunderstood about the nature of what Emma was actually fighting. I want to be honest that Emma's recovery, even after that 60-day program, was not a straight line. She relapsed once 4 months after completing residential treatment, a stumble that terrified Carol and me, but that her treatment team helped us understand, with considerable patience, as a common and survivable part of many people's actual recovery trajectory, rather than a sign that everything had failed. Asterisk, if you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Asterisk, it was during Emma's second stretch of sustained sobriety, roughly a year after that difficult September morning, that something happened involving the Camaro that none of us had anticipated. The private buyer who'd purchased the car from Emma, a man named Curtis Yancey, who ran a small classic car restoration shop outside Knoxville, reached out to me directly, having tracked down my contact information through the original title transfer paperwork, wanting to understand. He told me on the phone a specific detail about the car's mechanical history that had been bothering him since the purchase. Curtis was 61 years old, a careful, methodical man who had spent his entire working life restoring classic vehicles, and he told me, over that first phone call, that something about the original sale had bothered him from the beginning, Emma's specific desperation during the transaction, the price considerably below the car's genuine market value. Details that a man with decades of experience buying classic cars from all kinds of sellers had learned to recognize as signs of a seller in some kind of crisis, rather than simply someone looking to offload an unwanted vehicle. He told me he'd held onto the Camaro in his own garage for the year since the purchase, unable to fully bring himself to resell it or begin the restoration work he'd originally planned, a hesitation he described as instinct rather than anything he could. Asterisk, if this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. Asterisk, I want to describe what it felt like to stand in Curtis Yancey's garage 3 weeks after that first phone call, looking at my father's Camaro sitting exactly where it had sat in my own garage for the better part of a decade, still covered, still essentially untouched since the day Emma had sold it. Curtis told me that afternoon that he wanted to sell the car back to me, at the exact price Emma had originally sold it for, an offer that felt, in the moment, considerably larger than the financial transaction it technically was. "I've bought a lot of cars from a lot of people in 30 years of doing this," Curtis told me, standing in his garage with his hand resting on the Camaro's hood in a way that told me he understood, better than most strangers could have, exactly what this particular vehicle represented. Most of the time, it's simple: somebody's ready to let go of something, and I'm ready to take care of it for them. This one felt different from the moment your daughter walked into my shop. I could see she wasn't selling it because she was ready to let it go. I could see she was selling it because she felt like she didn't have another option left. I've got a nephew who went through something similar a few years back, and I recognized the look on her face, if I'm honest with you. I didn't feel right restoring this car and reselling it to some stranger while that memory was sitting in my garage. I think it belongs back with your family. Asterisk, if you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going. Asterisk. I did not have the words, standing in that garage, to fully thank Curtis Yancey for what he just offered. And I want to tell you that the moment was not simple, that alongside the overwhelming gratitude was also a specific, complicated grief, standing there looking at the exact car my father and I had rebuilt together decades earlier, now carrying an entirely new chapter of family history layered on top of the old one. A chapter involving addiction and desperation, and a daughter I still loved completely, even in the depths of understanding how badly her disease had once frightened both her parents. I brought Emma to Curtis's garage myself, 2 weeks later, without telling her in advance what she was going to see, wanting her to be part of the moment the car came home, rather than simply informing her after the fact. I want to describe what it looked like, watching my 25-year-old daughter, 11 months into her second stretch of sustained sobriety, standing in front of the Camaro she'd sold in a moment of active addiction she barely remembered clearly, her hand coming up to cover her mouth, tears starting almost immediately. Not, she told me later, out of simple relief that the car had come back, but out of the specific, overwhelming confrontation with concrete evidence of exactly how far the disease had once taken her, standing directly in front of the one object in our family that had always represented, to both of us, something worth protecting above almost everything else. Asterisk, if this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. Asterisk. I don't know how to say I'm sorry for this, Emma told me, standing in that garage, her voice breaking in a way I hadn't heard from her since the earliest, rawest days of her original diagnosis. "This wasn't just a car, Dad. I know that. I knew it then too, somewhere underneath everything else, and I did it anyway because I was too far gone to care about anything except the next few hours. I don't think sorry is big enough for what I did to you and Grandpa's. I don't know what would be." I told her, standing in that garage, the truest thing I had to offer her in that moment, that I had spent the year since finding the empty garage learning, slowly and with considerable professional help, to separate the disease from my daughter in a way I hadn't known how to do in the earliest, angriest days of understanding what had happened, and that watching her stand there, sober, present, genuinely grieving what the addiction had cost both of us, was, in its own complicated way, worth infinitely more to me than the car itself, however much the car mattered too. Asterisk, if you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel. Asterisk. I didn't know, standing in Curtis Yancey's garage that afternoon, that he was going to become something considerably more significant in our family's life than simply the man who returned my father's car, that he was going to offer Emma, 6 months later, a part-time position at his restoration shop. A decision he told me was influenced as much by his own nephew's recovery journey as by anything specific to Emma, wanting to offer a young person in recovery the kind of meaningful work he'd come to believe mattered considerably more to sustain sobriety than most people fully appreciated. I didn't know that Emma was going to discover, over the following year working alongside Curtis, an entirely unexpected aptitude for the careful, patient mechanical work that had once defined my own relationship with my father, or that watching her learn to rebuild engines in the same unhurried, exacting way my father had once taught me was going to become one of the most unexpectedly healing developments of that entire difficult chapter of our family's life. Carol has told me more than once over the past year that watching Emma at Curtis's shop, hands stained with the same permanent grease my own father's hands used to carry, has been one of the strangest and most moving experiences of her life as a mother. Not because it erases anything about the 14 months that preceded it, but because it feels, in its own unplanned way, like some part of my father's specific patience and care found its way, eventually, into exactly the person who needed it most, arriving decades later and through a route none of us would ever have chosen, but arriving all the same. But that's a story for next time. The truest thing I can tell you, 2 years removed from that Tuesday morning I found the garage empty, is that I have stopped believing recovery and loss have to exist in separate, sequential chapters of a family's story. Emma is 26 now, 20 months sober, working at Curtis Yancey's restoration shop 3 days a week alongside her teaching job, and the Camaro sits in our garage again, under its fitted cover, driven twice a year the way it always was, except now it carries 2 chapters of our family's history instead of one. My father's patient hands teaching a 17-year-old boy how to rebuild an engine, and my daughter's own hard one returned to herself, layered over top. Inseparable now from everything the car has always meant to our family. I don't think I would have chosen this particular path to understanding what that car actually represents. I think, given the chance to choose, no parent would choose watching their child nearly lose everything to addiction as the vehicle for a deeper family lesson. But I've stopped needing the story to have arrived here cleanly. What matters now is simply that it arrived here at all. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. And if you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, please know that recovery is possible, and that reaching out to a treatment professional or a trusted support line is a genuine, courageous first step. You don't have to carry it alone. Thanks for being here. For real.